So, good evening, whoever we're speaking to, ourselves and the audience. Hi, Beth, Dan, Krista. Right, okay. So this is the special meeting, January 31st, 2019, of the Harbor Coastal Zone Management Commission. And we have an agenda. We're going to start with some training, which is going to start at 7:45. Greg, did anybody have an extra agenda they brought with them, or can I borrow someone's? Thank you very much.
Not at all.
That's all
Not as
right.
good as that,
Second time.
I'll probably take 3 more times.
Okay, so I was thinking we were going to do the training first. I guess we can talk about the consultants. So let's just talk about consultants for a minute. Obviously, tonight we're going to have, oh boy, and I have the consistency expert, Steve Ressler, who wrote the consistency manual. That's kind of one of the first documents on our website. And I did put together which I sent you, which, Pam, you want to just handle about, that's kind of the guideline on that. As far as the other consultants, Sven has agreed to kind of do ad hoc consulting for us. He's no longer doing his major practice, but did I tell you that, Greg, or not? Okay, I think I told Dan. So I think it would be helpful to have him back in the loop. So what do we have to do that? And do you give him the work by project?
Yeah, if there's something that you believe there needs to be extra work done, if it's going to be on a project by project basis, then when you feel that it's necessary, let the village manager know, and the village manager would authorize that.
What type of consultant is that?
So
Environmental.
he's an environmental consultant, right?
Yeah.
And I had said that we would do that kind of on an interim basis, and then Pam recommended a person, and then so maybe what we'll do for the next meeting, we'll put, if anybody has any recommendations for consultants, don't send them to me, and then we'll ask them for their resumes and take a quick look. How would we hire a new consultant? Does it have to go before the board or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends, but I think it's within the manager's authority to hire consultants in that matter. We would probably want to work on defining scope.
Okay.
And I don't know if we would do a formal RFP. We might, but we'd have to talk with Dan about that to see what he thinks is the best approach.
I have 2 questions. So do you have a job description or a scope?
We have to develop one. We don't have one.
Okay. And the second is, in terms of Sven, my experience has been that when anything comes in with landscape, Sven would make a comment on it. So it's a little hard, so I think that should be the process. If something comes in and there's landscaping, Sven should make a comment.
Well, I think though I thought that from reading his memos, it was a broader than landscaping. It was kind of overall environmental, and so
Correct.
So I guess
Correct.
I was under the assumption that almost every project just the way we get
every project
right. So all right. So in that case, then are there projects, since there was kind of a lag in his operations, of the projects before us, are there any that he hasn't reviewed? One shore and 4 shore, obviously he didn't, because we didn't get those.
The current ones. Anything that's.
But the current ones, yeah, he hasn't reviewed.
Right.
I think he did Capel. He did Capel.
He did Capel?
He was the
He
last
did
one.
Perlman.
He did.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
Right,
really?
so as far as, and what about Hillside Avenue Bridge? Did he look at that one?
Yes.
Yes.
He did, okay. All right, so then, in fact, he's pretty much up to date on where we are. All right, so then, for the new ones, as the applications come in, we'll talk about that. Then we'll look at possibly other consultants. And then Paul Rubin is out there as a one also that we used before. Okay.
Speaking of Paul Rubin, on Hampshire, I don't know how far along it is, but I think there was an agreement by the applicant, and it would come out of escrow funds for a hydrogeologist to do that, so.
All right, so where is,
Paul do that one?
do we know where that, where is that?
That's at the planning board. Currently, they've provided a preliminary FEIS that the planning board is reviewing for consistency, and they're going to have comments back, not consistency or consistency. So they're going to provide comments back to the applicant, and they'll revise it, and eventually at some stage, once it's acceptable to the planning board, they'll accept it as a FEIS.
But shouldn't our commission review it prior to that?
I'll have to, we can talk with the attorney and figure out what the process would be.
Because that was kind of like we did discuss that last meeting. All right, so we'd like to do two things on Hampshire, I guess. One is see where we are in that process, and we're going to probably talk to Ressler about that tonight also.
And also, I should mention that we do have a consultant working chasing companies. They have a lead planner, and they also have a team of scientists, engineers that are supporting the EIS process. And as part of that contract, it includes Harbor Coastal.
Okay, all right. So have you had any preliminary reports or?
Yeah, they've been managing all the comments, taking them in and providing additional comments to that are influencing the environmental impact statement.
All right, and then
Only on Hampshire or on everything?
But just on Hampshire.
Just
Especially
Hampshire.
They were brought in for Hampshire.
and that documentation is it on the web?
Yeah, it's attached to the planning board, and it will when it comes to you, everything will be provided to you.
So does the planning board decide if it's zoned, if they change the zoning? Because right now it's not zoned to do anything. Right?
Zoning is a legislative action, so that's board of trustees. There's any zoning change.
Oh, so, but it wouldn't come to us then if the zone wasn't changed, right? Because then they wouldn't be allowed to build anything, right? Isn't it zoned for recreational now or something?
That's what it says in our LW.
Yeah, it's R20. So they have what is believed to be a zoning plan.
Our LWRP identifies it differently. It's an EXO. Let me find that. That's why I was asking about all the maps.
The Hampshire is not on the agenda for tonight, so maybe we
Right.
should speak about it when it's actually before us and not now in general discussion.
Okay, I agree. So on the consultants and the Hampshire, let's do this, commissioners. Let's look at what the documentation that's on the web at the moment, and then at next meeting, we'll decide who we want as a consultant for that specific project. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. End of discussion on consultants. Greg, did you give Steve a call-in number?
Yeah, I did.
Right.
It's been provided to him.
All right.
He said he'll call in a couple minutes early. Should
Okay.
be expected to. And he'll just pop up on the speaker in front of people.
Okay.
And I should see him on here, right?
Maybe he might call in on a phone. I'm not sure.
All right, do we want to talk about process clarifications briefly before Steve comes? So let's talk about process applications.
Look at that.
Oh, there he is.
Hello?
You have to push
I
a
can put him on
button.
the screen.
Do I have to push anything? Can you hear me, Steve?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Hello.
Hello.
Hi,
All right.
Steve. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, Steve, we're in the courthouse, and with us we have I have the Vice Chair Jen. We have Penelope. We have Pam Michaels. We have Thomas Burt. Sorry, Doreen Roney, and Tricia Light. And then from the village we have Greg Cutler. We have our attorney Krista Halpin, and then we have one trustee, Dan Natchez, and we had a couple of guests. So that's
Okay.
on our side. You want to tell us who's on your side? No, thank you. So we have 3 new commissioners and obviously new leadership here. And we kind of wanted to get kind of an overview of this LWRP and this process that we go through. And so I had put together the document that I sent you, and it would be great if you could just be concise, give us this. So let's get started and maybe pause every now and then for questions, okay?
Okay. Do you want me to start from what you sent me, or do you want to ask questions and have me try to answer them as briefly or succinctly as I can?
I think an overview of the process would be good for our new commissioners, a brief overview of the process, keeping in mind that we do only have 45 minutes for you. So a brief
You're talking now about when you say process, the consistency review process?
More so how we act in connection with DOS.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite understand that. You're asking about the relationship between you and DOS, or
Yes.
do you need a very brief, quick summary of the program and your role in it, DOS's role in it, and the role of other state agencies?
I think we know
Which I
what
can
your
do too.
role in LWRP is. You know, I know Doreen and Pam and Tony and I know it. Are you comfortable, Penny, and Tricia? You comfortable, and Tom?
I'm up to listen to anything he's going to tell us.
Yeah, I'm open.
Okay.
Might as well go through it.
All right.
Start at the beginning.
Okay, I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. The program stems from the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. And in that, Congress basically said that there's no way to manage all the many things the government does in any comprehensive manner unless you involve the states and the federal government in some kind of a national program that has some basic objectives to it. And those objectives are embodied in the federal statute itself, and they're repeated in New York state law as a result of New York State deciding to enter into a voluntary program with the federal government. When New York spent 8 years or so trying to develop some means of making all the things the government does at the municipal, state, and federal levels, making sense out of it all, and coordinating regulatory and other types of decision-making, funding, or the direct undertakings of the federal government and all of its agencies, saying at the state level and municipal level, they realized that the state and the federal government have very, very little land use control. They have a lot once you touch the water and go out into that public space, but on the land side, most of the control in most of the states lies at the local government level. So what New York decided to do as it began developing some means of making all the things that we needed to make work, it provided a means for municipal participation in this federal-state partnership. And that's essentially what you've got through your local waterfront program. So what this all plays out like is that the federal government enacted some federal coastal objectives dealing with everything government does, from economic development to resource protection, transportation, recreation, protection of natural resources, you name it, it's in there. and said to the states, we're going to waive the federal government's sovereign right to make its own decisions in and affecting your coastal area if you buy into this program with us, develop a comprehensive means of managing everything that goes on in the coastal area, and you can tell us what applicants for federal authorization or funding, you can tell us whether or not you object to what they want to do. And if you do, we will not authorize it or fund it. You can tell federal agencies that you object to what they intend to do. And while there's no absolute here that says that the federal agency can't do what they want to do, there's a process where the state and the feds have to meet to resolve any problems they can, come to some kind of agreement. The state essentially did the same thing to local government. It says if you play into this program with us and you develop essentially a comprehensive plan for your coastal area that embodies or incorporates in it all of the state's coastal policies, which mirror federal objectives, and makes sense of it all, given the circumstances of your municipality, the state will also essentially provide what's called a partial waiver of its sovereign right to make its own decisions in the coastal area affecting your municipality. So that's the basic structure of it. The three different levels of government, in this case, the village, the state, and the federal government, have very distinct authorities and roles to play in all of this. Neither one preempts the other, really. What I'm getting to here is so that you understand how this plays out. When someone is applying for a permit, which is most of the things that you're dealing with at your end in the regulatory world, when someone applies for a federal permit or a federal license or other form of authorization, they certify to the federal government, not to the state, they certify to the federal government that they have compared what they're asking for permission to do against the policies and purposes of a state coastal management program, which includes or is in your municipality, your LWRP, and what they are asking for permission to do will be undertaken in a manner consistent with your LWRP in this instance. A copy of that and everything that goes to the federal agency goes to the state, the Department of State. The Department of State reviews that and either essentially agrees with what the applicant has said or disagrees with it. It's called a concurrence or an objection. If the Department of State objects to that certification by the applicant, it's not a permit of any kind. Certification doesn't mean permit. It's an applicant's sworn statement that they've done what they're supposed to do to consider the relevant issues. The state objects to that. Federal law expressly prohibits the federal agencies, any of them, from authorizing it, and nothing is exempt from that except a presidential exemption, which has never been done. There's something similar to this at the state level, but there's no burden on an applicant to certify to anything. What we call state consistency provisions requires the state agencies conduct their activities or undertake their actions in a manner consistent with state coastal policy or an approved LWRP. And it goes beyond just policy with an LWRP. It has the state agency's action, its decision to issue or not issue a permit or to fund something or to do under something directly has to be consistent to the maximum extent practicable with the policies and purposes of your LWRP. And I can explain that later, but that includes the comprehensive land and water use plan you have in it that implements many of the 44 policies that you have in your existing program. In exchange for these waivers of federal and state sovereignty and the ability of the federal government and the state to make its own decisions, or a waiver of their sovereign right to make their own decisions without interference from you, the state says you develop an LWRP with the state, and once it's approved, the state now is bound by the policies and purposes of your LWRP. The state has less discretion than it would ordinarily have and has to conduct its activities consistent to the maximum extent practical with your LWRP. Now, at the state level, unlike at the federal level, where DOS determines whether or not what an applicant wants to do is or is not consistent with state coastal policy, each state agency makes that decision on its own. But they have to coordinate with you. The moment they begin to consider doing something, the moment they get a permit application, they're supposed to let you know that they've got it if it's in your municipality. In this case, the area covered by your LOP, which is your entire municipality, which answers one of the questions you had in what Tony sent me. They're not asking you for a formal consistency determination at that point. They're simply asking you to identify any possible conflicts between what permission is being asked for and what the result of the state's decision might be, which would be to authorize or deny it, with the policies and purposes of your LRP. So if someone is applying to do something that doesn't comport with your zoning law, for example, or in what we call Section 4 of your LRP, someone's proposing to provide for residential use, a residential structure in an area that's zoned for marine commercial business, that's clearly not consistent with your LRP. It conflicts with the land and water use plan in it, and most of the policies in your program, which are implemented by that plan. You would simply respond to the state agency and say, yeah, there either is a potential conflict or is a conflict here. What's being proposed conflicts with our land and water use plan and would therefore not be consistent with policies 1, 2, 4, 7, 12, 17, 33, 44, as a for example. It doesn't have to be an absolute, it doesn't have to be a formal decision. Your formal consistency decision making is done at your end for anything that you do in accordance with village law. And this is where there's an awful lot of confusion in Mamaroneck and elsewhere. You, as the village's coastal commission, act in accordance with your village laws. State agencies act in accordance with state law. Federal agencies and the Department of State, even though it's a state agency, act in accordance with federal law. Now, I missed something here. When someone applies for a federal permit and they make a certification to the federal agency and provide a copy to the Department of State, that's all part of the federal process. It's not a state process. It's part of the federal process in accordance with federal law and regulations. The Department of State is obligated now to reach out to you and ask you the same thing that the state agency is obligated to ask you. Is there any potential conflict between what is being considered here and the policies and purposes of your LRP? And that gives you the chance to give them a heads up and say, there might be, or no, we don't see any potential conflict there. And you can also not respond for 30 days, and there's a presumption that you have no concerns and the Department of State can go ahead and make its decision without any input from you. So that's it in a nutshell. At your end, your village coastal commission, I don't fully understand what laws you've got now because I know a number of them have been amended over the past couple of years and I haven't seen all those. But either the coastal commission or another village agency determines whether or not what's being considered for village authorizations or village funding or direct action, as they call it, pursuant to secret, on the part of the village agency is or is not consistent with state coastal policy. And that's where you come in because you now have a role in all of that. In either when you act as the Harbor Commission, for example, you're determining whether something is consistent or not and whether or not you should or shouldn't issue a permit. I know that your role in the decision-making process for other agencies has changed a bit now, and in some cases you're more advisory rather than having direct decision-making authority that you had before. But your job is to determine, in either case, whether or not something is or is not consistent with the policies and purposes of your program.
Can I ask a question?
And that's supposed to affect the decision by whichever agency at the village level is required to issue or deny the permit.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of the state documents had said, like, specific with marshlands, like it said, I'm not sure actually which one said what, either state or local. One said defend like to the ends of the earth, and the other one said defend within reasonable whatever. So how do we know?
So Steve, I think Steve, let me just,
Could that be repeated? 'Cause I really couldn't hear it very well.
Steve, I think what
Oh, yeah.
Tricia is referring to, and Tricia, correct me if I'm incorrect, is that when we talk about consistency in general, we talk about consistent to the maximum extent practical with
Practicable, which is not
right,
practical.
yes, practicable with the 44 policies, which there are a few of them have an NA next to them in our program. Also in our
Right.
program, under wetlands, under the explanations, it says wetlands should be protected to the maximum extent possible. And so, as I think we've all kind of been thumbing through these policies, it seems like there's a large difference between maximum extent practicable, which is the general consistency provision, versus the one on the wetlands where it's in the explanation, it says to the maximum extent possible. So Tricia, was that what you were
Yeah,
referring
that
to?
was
All
what I
right, so that was, so I
Yeah.
think it's categorized the question correctly.
Well, between the words practical, practicable, and possible, practical means it has to do with practicality. Practicable is very different. It means essentially that you have to do anything and everything possible. If it can be done, it must be done in a manner to make it consistent with policy, unless doing that is prohibited by law. So it's much stronger than much stronger than practical. Possible, I don't know the origin of that word in your program. I'm not sure why that word was chosen in the explanation of policy. But that is not the standard. The standard is the policy statement. The explanation of policy, it's done in some general planner speak, if you will. Although it was written primarily by local citizens and Department of State staff trying to help out. I believe Dan was there in those early days. All it does is provide some means of interpretation of how the policy is supposed to work, where it's supposed to apply, how it's to be implemented. But it's not an absolute. It's not a firm standard. The standard is the policy and the policy objective, which is protect and preserve.
Well, it's interesting because none of those words are actually in the policy. Not possible, not practical, not practicable.
Well, policy 44, no, they're not.
Right.
I'm using those terms because the standard for consistency decision-making is whether or not something is consistent
Right.
to the maximum extent practicable with the policies and purposes of your program. So that standard applies to every one of the policies that applies in any given circumstance. So you don't have to agonize over the word possible versus practical versus practicable. The standard of consistent to the maximum extent practicable applies to every policy.
And Steve, you defined that a moment ago as to do anything and anything and everything possible. Can you finish the statement? So,
unless it's prohibited by law. So if the design of something or someone wanted to do something, and when I say by law, at the federal level, for federal consistency, again, because there are three different types of consistency decision-making take place here, and you really have to focus on those three distinctly different roles of government and separate them. At the federal level, it means that the federal government has to do everything that can be done to ensure that whatever it's considering doing will be consistent with every policy of the state's coastal program unless federal law prohibits them from doing that. For an example would be years ago, they used to dredge the inlets in the South Shore of Long Island in the Atlantic Ocean, and they said that they were going to put the sand, dump it out in the Atlantic Ocean. And we said, no, you're interfering with you're impairing the physical coastal process on the shoreline. That sand has to get back on the beach. And they said, well, yeah, the state's going to have to pay us pay the $10 million cost to put it on the beach instead of dumping it out in the ocean. And we said, no, you have an obligation to meet our policy standards. You're not to impair the physical coastal processes that take place and provide stability to the barrier islands. The obligation is on your part to do everything you can. And they said, well, the federal standard doesn't allow us, we're required to, by law, to essentially lowball it. And we said, no, this is a higher standard. There is no law prohibiting you from putting the sand on the beach. You have to do that, and you have to bear the cost of it, not the state. That's just an example.
All right, so Steve, Tricia, is that okay for now? All right, so let me go to my first bullet point because we're kind of talking about consistency. And so my question is, we can say something is consistent with all 44 policies, which means it's consistent.
Well, it's whatever policies apply given the circumstances, because not all the policies will apply in every circumstance.
We can say it's not consistent with a particular policy, which means then that the project is not consistent. And are there any other? Can we say anything else?
One of the questions I think you have on that sheet came from something I told people at, I think, one of the workshops or something. It's a double negative. It's the term not inconsistent. That is very rare. It's really not used very often. But the example I usually give everywhere in the state, except for some places in the Mamaroneck, is a private dock accessory to the residential use of privately owned upland. In most instances, most small catwalks and floats for mooring a vessel that are accessory to the private residential use of the upland don't have an effect on state coastal policy. Most, not all, most. Or if they're constructed in a certain manner, and in most places it's elevated, their width is minimized and whatnot, so the effects on wetlands are relatively insignificant, so that you're not now going to run afoul of, say, Policy 44 and impair the functions and values of the wetland. It really doesn't conflict with any state coastal policy objective. Some of them do, which is why we have objected to some of them over the years. And some municipalities develop stricter standards and apply at the federal and state level and expressly prohibit them in certain areas, or require a specific design, or limit them to very specific areas. But in most cases, they really don't affect coastal policy. And that's important to understand too, because, and this ties in with SECR and everything else as this all plays out. If something affects to any degree and in any manner policy, that effect is significant, whether it affects something adversely or beneficially. If it affects policy, that effect is significant. And that's why this is supposed to be used early in the review and decision-making process, because it does, this goes to one of your questions, it was specifically designed this way and meant to guide the secret decision-making process as well. So you really have to focus in on that. Will what's being considered, your first question is, what will what's being considered, what will this affect? Will it affect wetlands? Will it affect visual quality? Will it affect historic resources? Will it affect the public's rights and abilities to get to the shoreline or access and use the resources? Is it in accordance with a comprehensive plan to provide water-dependent uses in specific areas or exclude them in other areas? Those are your basic questions. And you compare that then against the purpose or the objective in each one of those policies. If a policy says, and I'm going to paraphrase here, provide for water-dependent uses, in a specific part of Mamaroneck Harbor, and someone is proposing to do something else there that's going to conflict with that objective or preclude a water dependent use there at some point in the future, that's not consistent with the policy objective. It's as simple as that. Doesn't matter how you design it, doesn't matter what the height of it is, the color of it, how it's engineered or anything else. As a use, it's not appropriate there. And that's really how you simplify all this. Is what's being considered as a use appropriate in the area within which it's being considered? And that plays out in your role as the Harbor Commission also when you're looking at floats and docks and the arrangement and rearrangement of them in some of your perimeter areas and whatnot, adjacent to the areas on the upland side that are zoned for marine commercial and marine recreational uses. If someone were proposing, this question came up a couple of years ago when I was down in the village, if someone were proposing a private dock or structure or float or something in front of or in the harbor in front of or on the water side of an upland area zone for commercial water dependent uses, would that not be consistent with some of your policies? And my first reaction would be no, it wouldn't be consistent with it, because now you're essentially running in conflict or acting in conflict with your plan to provide for important commercial or public recreational water dependent uses in that space. The same thing you go through when you consider whether or not a commercial or retail or industrial use of the upland belongs in an area that's zoned for residential uses.
So,
Not appropriate. Zoned for residential uses. Don't even think of coming here. You don't have to assess it to death. You don't have to go through the secret process to know that it doesn't meet the basic standard, which prohibits that kind of a use in that area. You don't need to go through the secret process or the consistency process. There's a direct conflict right there. It's over.
We have a question.
Hang on.
Tricia?
well, if that's, so then where does the zoning change? Because we have a couple projects that could be coming up that's not zoned for something, but then.
Then that's easy. If someone is proposing to do something in an area that doesn't provide for it in your existing zoning law or in the land and water use plan in your LWRP, because that's the standard you're using for consistency. The laws in Mamaroneck have been amended over the years. Some of those laws have not been. Greg, are you there?
Yes. Hi.
This is really important. This is very important, it's something the village should be very concerned about. Many of the laws that have been amended over the years have not gone through the consistency review process. When your LWRP was developed and approved by the federal government and the state, the village said it was going to enact certain zoning and other provisions in the village code in order to implement the land and water use plan in Section 4 of the LWRP and the 44 policies those that were applicable in the village. If any of the laws that implement any element of the LWRP, especially its land and water use plan through your zoning law, is being amended or changed, you have a problem here because that is subject to consistency. That is supposed to go through the review process. And to be right up front with you about a lot of this, that's the sort of stuff an LWRP is in part meant to prevent. Because the village in some cases may wind up, or does wind up in some of these cases, taking actions now that are in direct conflict with its LWRP, and the state and the federal government now are looking at an LWRP that says something different from what the village is allowing. And that happens on the other way around also. The state of New York often fails, more so lately than several years ago, to run off on its own and make its own decisions without considering your LWRP. And that's the state process is the weakest link in this whole process, by the way.
Steve, on that note, when changes are made on a village level, like these that we're speaking about, as far as consistency is concerned, doesn't this have to go to the Secretary of State?
Yeah, it does.
And be,
Yeah, because because the Secretary of State and the federal government relied on the laws that you said you were going to enact or enact new laws and amend existing laws. Copies of those laws were given to the Secretary of State and the federal government. They were reviewed to ensure that they would, in fact, implement the policies of your program and make sure that it was all legally defensible and whatnot, and would make everything work as it's intended to work at your end, and that the state and the federal government could also defend that later on. And in some instances, the Secretary approves a local law that implements an LWRP. If that law is subsequently amended without the Secretary seeing it, it's not going to work. It's not been approved.
we still have to stick with the laws that are within our LWRP then. Because they are
Well,
listed.
the laws implement the village law. Many sections of the town code implement the policies and purposes of your LWRP to varying degrees. If you have a wetlands law, that obviously implements policy 44, but it also implements policy 7 relating to significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats or your locally designated habitat to some degree. It also applies to the development policies right up front, the first several policies, because it, in different manners, affects the appropriate uses of wetlands versus other areas. So it limits development that's clearly inappropriate in a wetland. And when you read those development policies, by paraphrasing them a bit, I'll go off on a tangent because it might help explain this. A judge once said to me, Mr. Russell, you have 44 conflicting policies here, and you can't possibly meet all of these objectives by putting this commercial water-dependent use in this area where it's going to affect a significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat. And I said, first, Judge, the policies don't conflict with one another. They're competing governmental objectives. Our job in consistency or decision-making is to make sure that we meet every single one of those objectives given the circumstances so that none of those competing policies conflict with one another or objectives conflict with one another. And he said, well, how do you do that? And I said, you don't put that use in or where it would affect the SIG-HAB. It's as simple as that. It's planning 101. Location, 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 just like real estate sales and whatnot. Location is everything in this kind of decision making. And Greg, as a planner, should, I assume, would best understand this. When you say, is this use appropriate here or not? That's the first question everyone should ask when they're entering the consistency review process. Is the intended use appropriate in this area? So when you consider a dock, you don't just consider the dock and its effects on its physical effects on the wetland and the biological integrity of the wetland and whatnot, but all the uses that come with it, and all the sound and the gas and the exhaust and in shallows, the effects of a crop in shallow sediments and whatnot. All of those things revolve around whether or not that dock and its use is appropriate in that area. Same applies in the upland.
So Steve, on this note of policy 14 bothers me a lot. I was on the flood committee, and this one says that activities or developments, including construction or reconstruction of erosion protection, shall be undertaken so that there will be no measurable increase in erosion or flooding at the site of such activities or development. And so one of the problems, it seems to me, that we have in our village is that we get flooding, obviously, and the greater the storm, the greater the flooding, obviously. And so our SWIP kind of says, from what I've gathered, that it requires no increase in kind of runoff with the 25-year storm. So to me, to me, policy 14 here does not say the 25-year storm. It says there should be no measurable increase in erosion or flooding. So I'm struggling on the interpretation of policy 14, comparing it to the SWIP, which says 25 years, because most of the bad flooding happens in, say, the 50 and the 100-year storm, not the 25-year storm. So I'm not asking.
Your elder for consistency purposes, for federal, state, and village consistency decision making, policy 14, the statement right there is what applies.
Right, not our, what you're talking about, Tony, is what's in our law. That was changed.
I'm not an engineer, but just to, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but my understanding of.
Well, hang on, Greg, be careful.
I'm gonna be careful. My understanding is if you're designing for a 25-year storm, it wouldn't be exacerbating something at a 100-year storm either, because you're already accepting some water. But I am not an engineer, so.
I do know that in our floodplain development regulations, if you excavate for development, there must be also somewhere on the site where you take an equal amount of excavation from where you developed on the property.
Yeah, that's the hydraulic equivalent.
Right, but that is up to the building department. We're doing consistency, so
Right. So
those details.
right, but what I'm
shouldn't
saying,
concern
my
us.
question here is, which is that this policy 14, so there should be no measurable increase in erosion or flooding during construction or development.
Right.
So
Right.
Right. So okay.
So that justification needs to come through the records we get from the applicant.
All right, Steve, I'm just going to look through my questions here. Oh, so one of the things that I read in your manual, that not a balancing act, not a mitigation process. So can you just briefly talk about that? So if we see something that's in a policy that doesn't look too good, and we say, well, if you make something else better, we'll go along with what doesn't look consistent. And to me, that's...
Yeah, you don't get to do that. You don't get to balance or trade policy against policy. And I think the words I used in that, which come directly out of the Coastal Management Program document itself when it was first developed, no one policy is to be advanced to the detriment of another. So if advancing a policy undermines in any manner, to any degree, because that's not what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with degree of effect. Does it or doesn't it affect the policy? And the question is, does it undermine the achievement of it or advance the policy and its achievement? That's what you're considering here. If in order to advance one policy, you're going to undermine another, you don't get to do it. You have to advance, you have to be able to achieve both objectives. There are two competing objectives. You've got to now avoid a conflict between the two of them by achieving both.
All right, and then Steve,
just so you know, the balancing act that's allowed through SECRA, when this was developed, when the state program and consistency was developed, it included an analysis of SECRA. SECRA had been on the books for, I don't know, 6-7 years at that point, and it really couldn't achieve all the things that it needed to achieve because it allows for the balancing. It allows you to advance a great and wonderful benefit of something and say, well, it's going to have relatively minor adverse effects, so we're going to allow it to proceed. You don't get to do that in consistency. And this ties in with mitigation because people will often say, well, I'm going to reduce the effects and make most of them go away. We're still going to have some, but they're not going to be as great as they would have been in order to allow something to proceed. You don't get to do that here. This is not a mitigation program. You have to achieve those policy objectives. Now, there's an exception to the rule, and it's akin to the variance process that a planning board, a board of zoning appeals would go through. There are, I believe, 4 standards in your consistency law that are similar to the standards that apply to state consistency for state agencies, and it's somewhat akin to, it's not a variance process at the federal level, it's an appeals process, but that is very tough to meet. I won't go into that now because it take up too much time, but every one of the standards in your, call it a variance process from full consistency with LWRP has to be met. And in most cases, and I don't really know exactly what it is in American, but it's usually has to result in some overriding village-wide and perhaps in some cases regional benefit. It will significantly advance other policies. Oh God, I can't remember all of them. There's no other, alternative, that kind of stuff. So I can't remember what's in your code.
So Greg, do you have them handy?
I have it right in front of me.
You want to just briefly read them, please?
So the first one is no feasible alternatives exist which would permit the action to be taken in a manner which would not substantially hinder the achievement of such policy. Second one is the action taken will minimize all adverse effects on such policies to the maximum extent practicable. The third one is the action will advance one or more of the other coastal policies. And the fourth is the action will result in an overriding public benefit.
Okay, so there you go. Every one of those
That
standards has to be met.
That sounds a lot like mitigation to
But
me.
all the
That
standards.
sounds,
That's not mitigation. It's really not.
read that
Because
last, Greg, for me.
Because in most cases, in most circumstances, things can't achieve all four of those standards. The example I often use is in an erosion hazard area, when somebody has a house there and they want to build and this doesn't apply as much in the Merrimack as it does on the North Shore of Long Island or along the Atlantic Ocean, but when a house is in an erosion hazard area, that erosion hazard area is a natural protected feature area. There is not supposed to be any new development of any kind, including seawalls, bulkheads, revetments, or anything else in that natural protected feature area because it affects the physical coastal processes that those features need in order to function and exist as natural protected features. And people say, what about the existing house? We have to protect it. And the response is, yeah, it has to be protected, or it's going to get wiped out at some point in the future. Move it.
Upland.
That's how you mitigate. That's what you do to achieve the policy objective. Move it. And they say, well, that's just not reasonable. Well, it is reasonable. It's going to cost money. And depending on where the house is, sometimes it costs less to move it than it does to build a wall. But that is what's required by Policy 17, by the way, which says that whenever a non-structural measure is available, you have to use it. You have no option. You can't even begin to consider a seawall or a structural approach to protecting the house, and it's the house to be protected, not the land proper, by the way. You have to move the house if that option is available.
Okay, Steve.
Get it away from the hazard.
The exceptions all have to be complied with, or just one of them?
All.
All of them together?
All of them. All four of them have to be met.
Okay.
And that's not really, in most cases, that's not a decision that the commission would normally make. In many of the municipalities that I've worked with over the 35 years that I did this, it usually goes to a different body in an appeal of a decision of the commission. And in that instance, it would be like a village trustees. And they would have to go through the same sort of decision-making process you go through, and in order to determine whether or not those four standards could be met. And by the way, this is important when we talk about appeals and secret and whatnot, because I know you've got that question in here. How does this relate to secret and whatnot? I said earlier that consistency is meant to guide the secret decision-making process. It can usually be done very early on instead of late in the game. Oftentimes you can determine right up front whether something will or will not meet your policy objectives, and that will help guide the rest of the secret process or bring it to a conclusion right then and there. If it's not consistent with any one of our policies, it comes to an end. It stops. You don't need to go through the secret process to tell you it doesn't meet a standard. that you already know it doesn't meet. It's over. It's done. You deny it. If an applicant wants to appeal that decision, the denial, then it would be, let's say, the Board of Zoning Appeals. I forget what you call it, a Zoning Board of Appeals or Board of Zoning Appeals, whatever it is in your village. That's when they can initiate a secret process. And if they don't have sufficient information to determine whether or not all the standards for the granting of appeal can be met, then you go through the secret process and require an EIS to get information that's not ordinarily readily available to you so that you can make a decision or draw conclusions and then make a decision. So the secret process and the consistency process at your end and at the state level are meant to work together. But the consistency review process, and if you read the secret regs, you'll see right in there that anytime a state agency is involved in any type 1 unlisted action, that draft EIS has to have the coastal policy analysis we always talk about in there, because that drives the entire process as you go through it.
So Steve, can I ask you a question on that? When the decision is made as to what type of project is it, 1, 2, or unlisted, it seems to me that's made early on, and it's generally made without the Harbor Coastal Review and the LWRP. And so that decision of whether it's 1, 2, or unlisted has a significant impact on which projects move forward and not. So should our Harbor Committee be involved in the kind of thought process of which type of action it is?
No, because your actions are defined in your, I assume they're defined in your local environmental quality review law. They're defined in SECRA itself.
Yeah,
and they're defined in the SECRA regs. They're defined in the SECRA regulations, which, by the way, are going through yet another amendment. Deadline due for comment, I think, the beginning of, or tomorrow, or today.
We don't have a local.
I think when Charlie McCaffrey was working with the village trying to figure out what should and shouldn't be subject to consistency in the village, he and I spoke at length over the years. Type 1 and unlisted actions in your village are subject to consistency. There's no doubt about that. Type 2 actions, whether or not you want to subject certain types of type 2 actions to consistency is up to you. Depends on how your village consistency law is crafted. What I usually do is tell people that, keep all of your type 1 and unlisted actions as actions that are subject to consistency. But then what are the types of things that are ordinarily, or that are defined as type 2 actions pursuant to SECRA? Like a dock, a small dock, less than 4,000 square feet in size, accessory to the residential use of privately owned upland area, is ordinarily treated as an accessory structure sometimes pursuant to SECRA, and is exempt from SECRA because it's a type 2 action. You can then include in your consistency law a list of things that would ordinarily be type 2 actions that are subject to consistency. So they may escape the environmental quality review process, but they don't escape then the consistency review process.
If I may, that's actually exactly what was done in, I think, 2015, when the new LWRP was sent to the state. Chapter 240 was amended to provide a list of actions that are exempt from consistency review, and it basically echoes the type 2 list, actually the proposed type 2 list at the time, which has changed somewhat. So we have our own list of actions, but it specifically includes that docks and anything getting a wetland permit is subject to consistency, even though that's typically to action.
But here's a classic example. If you have a residential or commercial structure that is in our landmarks or our architectural, historical, cultural list or is eligible that falls under the seeker type 2 list, we're losing that. Because the type 2 list in our consistency law, it mirrors the seeker type 2 list. So I think we have to talk about maybe updating that and talk about.
But an historic structure within 5 years, an historic structure is not treated as a type 2 action in SECRA.
True. I'm talking about redevelopment.
Oh,
People, we have a lot of older buildings in our community, which we haven't done a survey in quite a long time, since the 80s.
oh yeah, we've talked about that, right. So everyone knows that the Doreen has obviously, as some of you probably know, been asking a lot of questions over the years about historic structures and whatnot. I know that people in the village have over the years too. And I think, I believe I wrote something about it years ago. If a structure is on the list or eligible for listing on the national or state register, it is subject to consistency. It is subject to policy, your historic resource policy. It does not have to be specifically identified in your LWRP as, 273 South Main Avenue is an historic structure and is to be protected by this policy. If it is eligible for inclusion on the national or state register, that policy applies to that structure.
I don't know that anyone's catching that stuff though.
Yeah, so.
There's
so-
development
We will
happening in spaces that are eligible, that are being have been approved and that are going to be developed
Yeah,
and
there's
torn
nothing-
down.
Yeah, so on the actions exempted, if the project still meets that list that's exempted from consistency, whether or not it's on a historic register, we've been following that it's exempted.
Well, no, the
Because
point
it doesn't
being
say-
is,
But the issue is it on the state or national registers?
No.
Or is it eligible? Is it eligible for it? And if the state historic preservation officer has said it's eligible, then that policy standard applies.
If who says it's eligible?
state historic.
Yes.
So who,
State
the
historic
onus
preservation.
is on whom to bring that person in? Because
We have to get state historic preservation officer to talk about, is it eligible? When we receive.
Right, and there's a consultation process here, so anyone can make an inquiry to what we call the SHPO
Yeah.
and ask them for a determination. And they will tell you, they will say either is eligible or is not eligible.
But it's up to one of the committees or commissions in the village. Someone in the
No,
village
no.
has to.
Someone has to ask the question, yes. So,
We have to ask the question.
And our application process requires the applicant to get all the permits.
to provide that information, right?
Right, either the permit or a statement from the agency saying that they don't need a permit. So it's
That's
the
interesting.
applicant's responsibility.
The whole reason why I brought this up, though, is our type 2 list, the secret type 2 list, our consistency law talks about square footage of residential or commercial structures, a certain amount of square feet. But it could be that a cultural resource that we would want to protect.
Right.
So for
So
example,
there's a conflict with our law right there.
there could be a single-family home that's eligible, but because it's a ministerial action in the village to redevelop a single-family property, it wouldn't go before you.
But the building inspector should be asking for a consult with the State Historic Preservation Office, because we have not done a survey since.
It's
the
so not
early
happening.
80s. It's anything that's 50 years or older.
Yeah, that's not happening.
And also, it needs to be evaluated. But that's only one policy. We haven't done our inventory of that, is the point. We haven't updated inventory of what might be eligible.
And that's not
Yeah, I
coming
think-
as part of the new comprehensive plan or any of that stuff.
It needs to come from the LWRP update. And we're
Right.
waiting for
Right,
the
which
Department of
is
State
out
to
there.
review and give us comments.
Right.
There'll be historic information in the comp plan as well. We're working on that chapter now.
So can I ask another question?
Let me just,
Yeah,
so,
go ahead.
Steve and Commissioner.
And just so look, I'm not on the clock here, so I'll take as much time as you need.
Thank you, Steve. We are a bit on the clock, but
I know you are. I know you are. But
go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry. And then we have a question.
oh, someone had a question.
Tricia.
Yeah, so, with permeable surfaces and all expanding, wouldn't it be that any house that was gonna like double a footprint need to see us? Or is that a different issue that it seems like many of these codes would include if you're losing permeable surfaces on your land?
That falls under FAR. That's a zoning issue.
Well, see, that's a problem because we were supposed to do a survey of the entire village and upzone, to prevent that kind of thing from happening. And I've been talking about, impervious surfaces on, not impervious surfaces, but lot coverage versus FAR, because that's what really saves our resources in the sense.
Right.
And
Well,
beyond.
lot coverage is also a
Yeah, it's lot
ZBA
coverage.
thing.
It's lot coverage.
It's a what thing?
It's a ZBA,
Well,
it's a zoning.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the project. So again, single-family homes are ministerial. Everything gets approved by the building department for applications. If it's a larger project and it's up for site plan review, there's a little bit more discretion on the planning board that the planning board will do to try and, well, not try and, they will push for as much permeable surface as possible in the project. And we'll see that through, just open spaces and also, other technologies like forest pavement, things of that nature.
So that means that basically contractors who don't have any real reason to protect our town can buy small lots with a tiny house and make it pretty big, and they would probably get around that?
They would still have to meet the lot coverage. It's just not, there's not a discretionary review involved. Like when you have a new building going up, usually there's like a special permit where planning board has some authority. And also your commission influences that too when projects go before you. Oftentimes the comments from the HCZM to the planning board will say, what's the difference? What's the percentage reduction in permeable and impervious surfaces?
Right.
But on a
65 is the house?
And 35 is the lot.
Oh, wow.
That's what we have now.
And no SWIP is required currently.
No.
Is that right?
So SWIP is required for anything that is, I don't want to get the square footage wrong. I think it's 2,000 or 1,000 feet of 1,000 feet of square feet of ground disturbance. So if you're doing a single family home, a SWIP is required, and it gets reviewed by the village engineer and our consulting engineer.
And does a SWIP take into account groundwater, or does a SWIP only take into account displaced rainwater?
I am not able to answer that question. I don't have the credentials to answer that question.
Maureen?
Oh, I don't either.
Doreen?
I'll only pretend to be an engineer once tonight.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, it's probably not in here.
All right, so anybody else? All right, so Steve, I think we're gonna thank you very much. And perhaps what we could do is maybe get our act together and do this again at another meeting, or at the beginning of another meeting. You were very helpful. And we have maybe one more question.
Couple more follow-up questions. One, when we are, we're not going to let you go that easily. When we are drafting our memo to DOS, when it comes before us, when we don't have an application yet, if an application is not before us, has gone to DOS before it's gone to us, and we don't really know how specific, and there are a lot of times that applications come before us, the applications are incomplete. We see a lot of applications that go before DOS that we think are incomplete. How specific does our memo to DOS have to be?
You don't have to be. You don't have to be specific. It's an inquiry. It's a heads up. That's all it is at that point. So if DOS has something that a federal agency is considering, and they send you a form letter or make a phone call to the village, to you or whomever the contact is, and say, please let us know whether or not there's a potential conflict here. It can be as simple as a telephone call saying, describing what you think might be a conflict. DOS has to make a record of that. It's better that you do it in writing or by email, but it can be as simple as a phone call. It's not a formal decision on your part. You're informing DOS. DOS ultimately is responsible for determining whether or not something that requires federal authorization is or is not consistent with your LWRP, which is also the state's LWRP. It's not just yours. It is the state's plan for the coastal area and the federal government's for the plan for the coastal area. And for federal purposes, the only entity that's allowed to determine whether it is or is not consistent with state policy is DOS. You're simply informing DOS at that point. You will have, in most cases, your own decision to make in accordance with the village laws. What we try to do, I keep saying we, I don't work for DOS anymore, but what the village and DOS and state agency, everyone else is supposed to do, is provide early coordination here so that we're all looking at the same thing at the same time and informing each other of what we think about it and where it's going and how it affects policy.
Okay, but the same
That's
holds
clearly not happening here.
for
But
private owner, right? Clearly not happening, but the same holds true for private owner. Yes?
right,
Okay.
What Steve said is key, though. When the Department of State gets in touch with us, it's when there's a federal permit. I know we,
Right.
Right,
Some-
well, right now, we have we have two applications that we've heard that are not even in front of us.
Mhm.
But, so Steve, we have two applications that we don't have them yet, but they're up at DOS, and DOS has requested
our input.
our input. So we were gonna send them back an email with what we see as possible conflicts. And then we have, I think, one application that is before us that we will be sending them a similar email. So Pam, you had a question.
I do. What is not clear to me is because our commission here has recommendation authority and not ruling or decision authority, it's not clear to me how it works then if it goes back to the board, usually the planning board or zoning board, and our recommendation is overridden
Or ignored.
well, however, yeah, so
it would be the term would be an override rather than an overrule. But so it is an override. It overrides the result, if you will, of a decision that something is inconsistent. The result is that you can't issue the permit. So it's an override.
So essentially that board is saying your view of consistency is incorrect. We view it consistency like this, and therefore this can happen. Is that true?
They don't, their job is not to second guess you when it comes to consistency with policy. This is important. This is the same thing we go through at the federal level. Not even the Supreme Court of the United States gets to second guess the Department of State's decision with regard to whether or not something is consistent with policy. The grounds for an appeal and an override are that something has to be in the interest of national security. And what that means is the result of the state's decision has to seriously impair the ability of the United States of America to defend itself from an aggressor nation, or it must significantly advance several national coastal objectives. Either one of those are very difficult standards to meet. And so the same sort of thing applies at your end. The village board, in this instance, if they're the ones the appeal goes to, or Board of Zoning Appeals, for example, is thinking of overriding or ignoring what you say. If something is not, it's determined if something is not consistent with policy and they're going to override that in appeal of the decision, it has to meet the 4 standards for an appeal, for granting an appeal. It doesn't get to look at all the other stuff and agree or disagree with your policy decision.
And if I could just,
Greg has a comment. Greg?
when it comes to private applications, you are not an advisory board.
Right.
Right.
Your consistency is a resolution that has to be followed by the applicant.
But it doesn't get carried forward.
Let me just ask a question. Are you sure it's the applicant and not the agency that's issuing the permit? Because that's the way it usually plays out. Consistency in these circumstances apply to the agencies, not the applicants.
I'm sorry, I'm not.
What do you mean by agency?
Let me just I'll make a distinction. At the federal end, it's an applicant that has to ask consistent with policy. So does a federal agency. But the interactions that we normally deal with are between the Department of State and the federal agency and the applicant has to meet all these burdens. It's different when a federal agency wants to do something on its own, like dredge or fund, that kind of sort of stuff. Then the burden is entirely on the federal agency. At the state level, state consistency applies not to an applicant for a state permit. If a state agency like DEC says to an applicant, you have to fill out this coastal assessment form, if I was that applicant, I would tell them to go jump off a cliff in some very unkind words. The law and the regulations require the state agency to fill that form out. It's the state agency action. It's their decision making. It's their decision to issue or not issue a permit that is subject to consistency. That's the action, not what the applicant's considering. You do an analysis as to what the applicant's considering or asking for permission to do and how that would affect the environment. And you also, as a state agency, are then obligated to consider what the effect on policy would be if you were to issue or deny the permit. That's the action you're considering. Same thing applies at the village end. Village agencies are required to act in a manner consistent to the maximum extent practicable with the policies and purposes of the LWRP. The agencies have to arrive at conclusions or decisions with regard to whether or not their actions to approve or deny or fund or do anything like that are or are not consistent with policy, not the applicant. Now, your law is, I don't know what it looks like now. I haven't seen it in years. But sometimes the municipality will require the applicant to do a lot of the work, the paperwork. But it's the agencies and their actions that have to be consistent with policy. And sometimes both, an applicant and the agency. But it's really important that you understand that. The action is the action taken by a regulatory or governmental agency to approve or deny or fund or do something.
So I wasn't trying to get to that granular detail. I was just trying to distinguish between a private applicant and the agency's decision around that versus the Board of Trustees and a village action, which is advisory. So when it gets sent to the
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Steve,
sorry.
let me back.
The bridge versus a house.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So let me just state and see if this sounds correct. Our Harbor Coastal Zone Management Commission, when we determine consistency on a private application, our decision is final.
Yes.
In the case of a village project, the appeal process is by another agency and it has to go through those 4 standards, correct?
If we find it
Yeah.
inconsistent.
Correct. And you as acting as Harbor Commission also have to meet those standards, by the way.
Right.
So we have to meet those 4 standards?
Either private or the village, if something substantially hinders a policy.
Well, I don't know what your law looks like. Again, that's my out here because I really don't know what it looks like right now. But as the Harbor Commission, you determine whether or not something meets your standards, and you You decide whether or not the permit should or shouldn't be issued. You're also making a consistency determination with regard to whether or not what an applicant is asking for permission to do is or is not consistent with your LWRP.
And then the Hillside Avenue Bridge example, or a local law, the Board of Trustees is to do, they look at your recommendations
Right.
and your review, and they make a consistency determination.
They make their consistency, right, based on your recommendation. But when you're acting as the Harbor Commission, does the village board have a role, or is it just the commission?
Just the commission.
Just the commission.
Just the commission.
Yeah.
So what your law should have in it is some kind of an appeal process, so that if the commission acting as the coastal commission determines that something, or no, acting as the Harbor Commission at this point, because you're going to wear two hats. You're going to act as the Harbor Commission and the Coastal Commission. You're essentially giving a recommendation to yourself. You're then going to switch your hat and act as the Harbor Commission,
Right.
and consider what the Coastal Commission has said in your decision to approve or deny. So if you determine that it's not consistent, who does the appeal go to?
Good question.
The Board of Zoning Appeals or the Board of Trustees?
We don't have that.
Or do they appeal you? And then the burden, if this were akin to an appeal in a zoning matter, the burden is on the applicant just to get in the door, and the burden starts shifting back over to you. And considering that, Greg can explain this at some point here rather than taking our time tonight, but the burden shifts back and forth between an applicant and the agency as you're going through that appeals process. Again, I don't know how your law is constructed. You could, it's up to you to decide how you want to do this. You could, if you make a determination that something is not consistent, you could at the same time include in your analysis and whatnot an assessment or analysis of whether or not it would meet the 4 standards for an override, or call it a variance so that people can understand it, and conclude it either would or wouldn't meet those 4 standards.
But every standard has to be met, correct?
All
Yes.
4 of them, right. So you've got 44 policies. Not all the policies will apply. Let's say 23 of them apply. Add the other 4 for a deviation, a variance, if you will, from the rule, that something be fully consistent to the maximum extent practicable with your policies and purposes of your liberty. There's got to be a safety valve somewhere in every regulation. That's what that's for. But it's a tough standard to meet. Unfortunately, it's not well understood, and I'll tell you that in more than 90% of the cases for the variances I've seen, I'm not talking about the consistency process, I'm talking about municipal variances around the state with regard to land and water use matters. They don't meet the state standards for a variance. People don't understand them, they don't know how to adhere to them, and they grant variances because Steve Russell's a nice guy, and it's difficult for him to do what we're requiring him to do, and let's give him a break. That's the kind of stuff they do. You can't do that.
Steve, can you tell us when it comes to, I know it's on the DOS website, but can you clarify the DOS's involvement in federal consistency and a federal permit?
DOS is not acting as a state agency in that respect.
Right.
The federal government has delegated its authority to the New York Department of State. Consistency in federal law is a requirement imposed on federal agencies. But in order to make all this work, and in order to get the states to buy into this program, this is like a reverse federalism. The federal government, I kind of started out with this in the beginning, said, we will waive our right to make our own discretionary decisions in or affecting your coastal area if you develop this program with us, and you can tell us what we can and can't do. They delegated the authority to the Department of State to make those decisions in accordance with federal law, not state law. DOS acts in accordance with the Coastal Zone Management Act, which is a federal statute, and federal regulations, not state law and not state regulations when it's reviewing something for consistency. It is not subject to SECRA. because it's a federal action. It's part of the federal decision-making process. There's a separate process for state agencies, and DOS is involved in that in an advisory role. They have no decision-making as they do for federal purposes, somewhat akin to the position you're in when you're dealing with things that the village trustees are considering doing. We advise state agencies with regard to whether or not what they're considering doing would or would not be consistent with state policy. It's up to them to make the decisions at the state level. And oftentimes we get into fights over it.
I just meant like federal consistency, meaning, for example, what we had here with our Army Corps of Engineers flood mitigation project versus an applicant with a Army Corps of Engineers permit in wetlands, for example. There's that federal, the federal consistency and the permit are separate. And I can forward.
They're different processes
Right.
that the federal agency and the state go through. So the processes are different, and that's explained in the manual.
Right.
More than 95% of the reviews that DOS does are for permit applicants or funding applications. Others involve things like dredging by the Corps itself, bridge reconstruction or design, flood mitigation plans, all that sort of stuff. Airports, every time a stop sign goes up at JFK, Department of State has to review it because it's an action being undertaken, or an activity, not an action. They don't use the same standards. By the FAA to approve the new stop sign. It's part of an airport layout plan. So I'm not quite sure where you were going there, Doreen, but the processes are different.
I know the process
That's
is
all.
different, but there's an involvement with the Department of State, and the Department of State seeks our input.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay. That's where you're going with that. You're right. When what the federal agency should be doing, though, is the moment they're considering doing something in Mamaroneck, the village of Mamaroneck, or outside of it, if it would in any way, directly or indirectly, affect any of your policies or any of your resources or any use in the village, they're supposed to go to the shelf and pull a copy of your LWRP down before they call anybody or do anything. That's what that document's for. That's why we made so many copies of it. That's why it's in the 3-ring binder, so it can be updated easily. And then we pass it around the entire country so a Corps of Engineer analyst down in Mobile, Alabama can go to his shelf and say, well, gee, the New York district is considering something in Mamaroneck. Let me pull down the Mamaroneck LWRP and take a look at it real quick and see if I can figure out what should or shouldn't be going on there. Then they contact you and the Department of State. That's what they should be doing. What they usually do, though, is first contact the Department of State and leave you out of it. Then it's up to the Department of State to contact you and say, hey, this is what the Corps of Engineers is considering. What do you think?
Actually, Steve, it's the other way. We have people coming to us and we have to advise them, you really
They go to
need
DOS, right.
Well, not only there, but, the joint application per se.
Right.
Because OGS is involved and all the various different Section 401 and that whole bang. I'm not sure if our new commissioners understand that yet. But what I'm going to do is forward a link to them, to the Department of State's
website. There is no, one of the questions you had on the list here had to do with who comes first.
Nobody.
There really shouldn't be, and I'm not sure whether you mean in the decision in the end, or who does the application go to first. The way we've tried to construct this, and the reason why there's a joint permit application between the Corps of Engineers and DEC and DOS and OPRHB and OGS, is because of this lack of coordination. So the joint application was developed so that when someone wants to do something and they need authorizations from all these agencies at 2 different levels of government, all the agencies are supposed to get it at the same time. I said supposed to. They don't. And that's because people have figured out that they can sometimes play agency against agency, and sometimes they honestly don't know.
Right.
But you and the Corps of Engineers and DEC, and DOS, and any other agency that's involved in any kind of discretionary decision-making should be involved from the get-go so that no one agency is left running down the track entirely on its own, unaware of all the concerns of other agencies.
Right, we should all have the information at the same time, so the applicant as well as all agencies can review it.
Right.
Just make a
Right.
decision to be done with it.
The federal regulations require an applicant, and obviously they have to provide whatever is required to be provided to a federal agency as part of its permit application process. In addition, it has to provide what's called the consistency certification to the federal agency, which is a form that the Department of State came up with. And there is other information they're required to submit, in addition to what they would ordinarily submit to the federal agency. So we've got generally a list of what's required. And sometimes, as with you, the Department of State doesn't get everything it needs, because when you begin to look at something and say, well, there's a huge missing part here, sometimes the applicant doesn't realize that had they done some level of analysis, they would realize some other information was required. And as with you at the village end, the Department of State winds up sending out a request for additional information or necessary information because the very basics weren't there and they can't even begin to initiate the time clock as part of the review process. You have that same problem.
Right.
The agencies just aren't getting the information. So the best you can do there is try to define as best you can what you consider necessary information and data. That's the term we use from the federal regs, necessary information and data, to begin the review clock. And if that necessary information and data is not provided, it just sits there, and if they don't provide it within certain time frames, we close the file, shut down.
Steve, we're going to have to put this to an end here.
I have one
Hang on, Doreen.
important question.
Hang on, Doreen. Thomas, you had a question?
Take it up in another.
All right, Doreen, we got to be.
Significant habitat, we have a local one. And I know the state has state designated. How is that? I know how we would treat it locally, but how is that treated at the Department of State level?
It's to be treated the same way a state designated habitat would be treated. The policy applies to that locally important habitat as it would apply to a state designated significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat.
Thank you.
All right, Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Hope it helped. Hope it
Yes.
helped. And if I confused anybody, I apologize.
That's-
You've done your job.
Have a good evening.
All right. You too. Be well.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so I'd like to take a quick break and then we'll move on here, okay? So we're gonna review what we need to respond to DOS on 941 Taylor's Lane. That's the next order of business, okay?
Okay, you're good.
Okay,
Professionalism here.
all right, so we're, Doreen and Tricia, are you guys ready?
So where are we going next?
Okay.
Captain O'Captain.
So the 941 Taylor's Lane,
Yeah.
we have an email from the Department of State
Yes.
and we have an email from DEC.
Yes.
DOS is the one that we have to respond to, and it's asking us for any of our concerns with the project. As
That's the one dated January 14th, yeah?
Correct. And from what we just heard from Steve, and we had a quick conversation with DOS, not on this particular property, but on another one. And no, so we had a quick conference call with DOS, not on this property.
We're talking about 941.
941 Taylor's Lane, which is Pearlman. And so we have to give DOS within 30 days any possible concerns that we have with this project, okay? So what I want to do right now is just go over any possible concerns, like in a bullet point form, so that we can then either disagree or agree that we're kind of in agreement with those concerns. Now, I will start by saying that the DEC application which was sent back to the applicant, basically says the application is incomplete. So
Right.
Beth, and Beth is here from, Beth, let me just, yeah, and are you the owner? Are you Mr. Perlman? Okay, so Beth and Mr. Perlman got a response from DEC saying that they had to provide a lot of information, and we've asked for a lot of information. And so one of the things we are probably going to say to DOS, or what we could say, is that we need copies of all this information, right? So that's kind of the bar, the lowest level of the bar. So I will say that's bullet point number one.
Yeah, we don't have.
Bullet A,
materials.
right? So there's a list of open stuff that DEC needs and that we want, okay? I'm not going to tell you, so I have a bunch of other concerns, but let me hear what other people have to say. So please be concise.
Well, on the joint application, the federal permit was not applied for, and that's how DOS gets involved.
Has been or has not been?
That's how DOS gets involved with consistency concurrence.
You don't need a federal permit. There is no disturbance to a wetland area.
Okay.
Not the point.
It is the point, excuse me. You don't need a federal permit for this application. I sent everything to DOS.
Beth, I know, but the point is the DOS does not get involved unless there is a federal permit.
That was clear when I applied, when I sent everything to DOS.
Right, but they're asking.
Why are they
us for
involved?
feedback. What I'm saying is their involvement does
Right.
not happen unless there is a federal permit.
There
So we
is
need to know the status of why they are asking us
Because of the tidal wetlands?
for coastal consistency.
Okay, so, all right, so that's a good question.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that under the joint application, right?
Right.
Tidal wetlands is checked.
Right. Right, tidal wetlands is checked, and this, to me, was this joint application that is triggering DOS to ask us for
Sure.
a response.
correct. And tidal wetlands is checked, as the commission knows, because we are doing work within the tidal wetland adjacent area on this property. We are not doing any work with the tidal wetlands.
Right.
So there's your distinction, adjacent versus within.
Correct. And the federal government, the federal Army Corps does not have an adjacent area, so they do not have a permit for this application.
Right.
Well, the one thing that we need, and I noticed that the DOS CC'd Army Corps of Engineers received the correspondence, is delineating mean high water, mean low water, the spring tide lines, and the high tide line
That's in that.
on the project plan.
Right, and that,
Because that's
Doreen,
how they
right,
determine.
and that is, so.
Requested,
Right,
already
so,
requested.
right, so that's already
Right.
requested. So our bullet point number one is going to be to provide the information requested by DEC.
Well, DOS probably does not have this. from the
Okay,
DEC.
well, but they're asking us our concerns.
Right.
And one of the concerns we have is that DEC is saying the application's incomplete. And so that there's a list of things that DEC is requesting for a complete application. So we're saying we need that information also, as well as some of the other things that we asked for. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers that bullet point unless someone disagrees with me.
It does, but you have to be specific with the DOS because mean high water line, mean low water line,
All right,
spring.
right, but Doreen, at the last meeting, we asked for all of those things. So
Right.
that should be in our minutes, which we,
Okay.
great, can we, I know we didn't do minutes and we kind of, so does Betty, do you know everything that we asked for? You made a list, all right.
And just so the commission knows, everything that was in that DEC notice of incomplete application was resubmitted to them yesterday by FedEx. They have everything. I was ready to run the presses and make copies for this commission when I found out about tonight's meeting, so.
Okay,
You should definitely get it in, so we have it.
so, yeah, so then will we put it on the website?
Thanks.
How,
Thanks.
when she sends it, how would we get it?
It would be for your next meeting, just regular submission, it would be in your packages.
Right, but the problem with that is that this is due the 14th,
Okay.
so that won't be timely enough.
But if you say that you are requesting a copy of everything that we respond to DEC with, that's fine. I
Right.
can send the Department of State that notice of incomplete application, or you can.
Yeah, we're gonna note it. All right. So, okay, so I think we're on the same page with that one. All right.
Policy 7, if we can move on, just because of the trees and all the tree work that's happening and the trees that are coming down, that's wildlife habitats shall be protected, preserved, and where practical, it says, restored so as to maintain their viability and habitats. I guess that's something that I would, just because there's a lot of tree work happening.
I'm saying bullet. All right. Another bullet point. Any other bullet points from people? All right. So to me,
Oh, geez.
the eligibility of the house for
Right,
for
and
the
that's here,
for ship up,
Yeah, it's
which
on
is in
there.
here. Okay. And then the other one that I
44.
is 44, which is the wetlands, is the wetlands, right? And so to the maximum extent practicable. So Beth, one of the things so I have a concern about wetlands in general, and I think DEC has some concerns. I had spoken to somebody at DEC about a week ago, and have they been down to the site?
Yes,
They did.
yes.
So I wonder, do you think that cleared up their concerns, or did that clarify their,
I know that the biologist who was at the site in September of 2018 has been in contact with Christopher Lang, who's the one who's reviewing the permit application. So I do believe that her concerns and his concerns were both reflected in that notice of incomplete application.
So not resolved.
right, so I think that's not resolved from our perspective, so.
Or theirs.
Or, right, that we're gonna say that this, all right, this our policy, we're concerned with policy 44, okay? Any other concerns?
And Beth, specifically in policy 44, or I'm not sure where exactly on this plan is, where is the low wall? Where is the low retaining wall?
The lower retaining wall is around the parking court.
So on the opposite side of
on
the house.
opposite side from the wetland, correct.
Could you just,
So the wetland doesn't go along the side of the house. That was
No,
all I had.
if you had asked that before,
Yeah.
the wetland, actually, the wetland boundary is the tidal wetland boundary. Part of the house, if you will, on the
Water,
on the
yeah.
Mill
well,
Pond
I tried to
side.
find it indicated here somewhere in all of these, and I could not.
Goes around all the way to 10.
Unless it's in picture.
I apologize, it goes
Don't have it enough.
back from the tidal wetland line, a long elevation 10. So that's the tidal wetland adjacent area for DTC.
Ours is 100 feet.
Which is 100 feet and includes all elevations.
Glasses.
So that's why we need a wetland permit.
I took mine
because
off so I
we're
could see better,
removing the
maybe.
pool, removing the terrace, removing the house.
That's on the opposite side
within
of.
the local wetland.
You see, the whole thing is we have to respond. Usually the DEC gets in
Why
touch with
is-
us when you have a complete application.
Yeah.
And, they provide us with information and they want us to assist them with consistency. Just like Steve talked about tonight. Not assist them, but ask us if there are any conflicts. And the DOS
It says.
on
the
this
second paragraph.
application,
The
I'm
reduced amount of
questioning
development
why
within the
DOS is
tidal
involved
wetland
because,
area
as you
is
say,
but will temporarily
there's no Army
increase the
Corps
Amount of disturbance to the
engineered
central
permit
portion of
needed,
the
but we don't
site
have a no
to accommodate
jurisdiction.
grading and a low retaining wall. So it's temporary. So in other words, they're going to have to go a little crazy around here in order to be able to make this happen, and then they'll build it back up.
All right,
Jen.
guys, we have one meeting, all right, please?
Sorry, we're just describing.
As visitors heard, the Army Corps, to get them to say we don't have any jurisdiction, they don't typically do that, but I did note that the notice of incomplete application from DEC was copied to the Army Corps. So I can send the Army Corps an email and ask Peter if he received that notice and send him whatever information he needs. I may be able to get an email back from him. I may not. I'm not going to promise that, but
on the joint application, it wasn't checked off for Army Corps because as you state, you're not thinking you need
Right.
an Army Corps of Engineers. It's
I
just
haven't
confusing.
considered that.
That's fine.
Well,
Yes.
on wetlands,
So why
on
is it-
wetlands.
Yeah, and then 23
Roast
around that. So.
There and on mean high water,
This
keep saying the wrong
since it's
Mean- yeah, it's mean high water, mean low water, and spring tide line. That's their jurisdictional boundary on the property.
That's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Army Corps.
We're not doing any work with him.
Is this property?
But we don't have
That is part of the package that
Yes,
you will get.
but it has to-
responses.
It has a,
Okay, so commissioners,
that. Oh, yes.
that's waiting to see if they're gonna
Still
put
have
a
that.
sewer up for the
Right,
whole
but we
neighborhood, or
also
that they're
need-
gonna take it on, if the whole, is that this property?
Any jurisdictional boundary besides the- I sent to all of us a long email.
I can't remember.
We need to find out who is the.
I can't remember, yeah, I don't have all of my things.
all right, Doreen, do we have, is that part of the list from the last
Yeah,
meeting?
yeah.
All right, so that's fine. I think, all right, so commissioners, can we get them a copy of that? All right, great. We'll get you a copy.
So we need records to support, there's no conflict with public trust lands, any title, ownership, deed, grants, leases, easements on underwater lands, existing land. I know we have the meets and bounds description, but we don't have this piece of information, and it's a couple of our policies.
All right, so Greg, before you send that out, can you send that to us so we can look at it and make sure we're in agreement with it, please? All right, Mr. Thomas?
We discussed 44 and wetlands preservation generally. Maybe it may be better to be more specific about concerns. I just wanted to sort of articulate my thinking about 44 is that the issues are whether a change in water flow across the property is going to detrimentally impact the wetlands permanently, whether a change in the water flow across the property is going to detrimentally impact the wetlands on a permanent basis based on the design, and whether anything in the construction process will do so on a temporary basis.
Thank you.
That's
Also, it's
how
a
I'm thinking about
significant
44.
fish and wildlife habitat. We have a designated SIG-HAB there.
Yep.
So policy 7A applies. The DOS, as Steve Russell just said tonight.
That is my concern too.
Okay, no, DOS, state designated SIG-HAB.
With the wetlands, the removal of the house in the wetlands, they're not considered,
The removal of the house in the wetland.
so where is the current house? Is it,
The house is outside of the wetland.
is it in the buffer area?
It's in the buffer area and it's being moved further
Right,
from the
that I'm clear on, so,
It's within the Mamaroneck 100-foot buffer or the DEC's 300 foot.
It is not within the DEC adjacent area. The only thing that is happening in the DEC adjacent area is grading. It is within the village of Mamaroneck's 100-foot.
right, so that's a concern. Okay, I think I'm, all right, so I think we will be a little more specific on our concerns, but wetlands is a big, definite concern. All right.
And habitat.
7A.
And habitat, 7A, habitat. All right, anything else? Okay,
That's good on that
so
one.
I think we're gonna close on that. Does, Greg, does the applicant get a copy of our letter to DOS?
Yeah.
All right, so you'll get a copy of our email for DOS.
I appreciate that. And I just, since there are new commission members, I was trying to ask, do you new members want, we started this application back in September. So I'd be happy to provide you with the answers and responses and information that have been provided to the commission prior to this month.
Is that all already in their little docket of documents? Everything, should everything be in
It's
there?
all online.
It's online. but
Okay.
I didn't know if you wanted
Printed,
paper copies.
I think we're good.
Thank you for that.
Thank you,
Alright.
though.
And I just so you know, too, if I may, I'm sorry to take up. The package I just sent to DEC is about yay thick, and if it's already, I'm going to submit it to you both in digital form, obviously, but also as 11 by 17s, which I think are quite
Yes.
readable. But
Thank you.
they sometimes take a little.
A little, I mean, as you
Yeah.
get my real
Right.
good glasses out.
Magnifiers, but I just hope that's all right. To have
No.
24 by 36 plants just seems.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Greg, is that
it's-
okay
it's-
with us?
Yes,
It's okay with you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I think it's fine.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, but
If
it
you have
is,
questions, I'm sure you'll
yeah.
clarify.
Absolutely. As I said, the digital copy.
Yeah, we can blow up that one.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks, Beth.
thanks, Beth.
Just a question, so
Yeah.
it's like policy 7, would there be something specific so we can address it, or how would we?
Well, we're going to be,
Well, potentially
Yeah,
to
yeah,
23
okay.
also until we get an answer.
all right, so commissioners, let's, so we're going to put together a letter of DOS with the concerns. They're basically going to fall under these categories that we discussed.
right.
And,
We have policy 23 potential.
Excuse
Sure.
me, I had done a draft. Where is it?
And we do have,
Yeah.
we need to have complete
I had
information, but these are
updated.
the policies that are concerned right now.
all right, so let's move on to the next two
Right.
applications.
Is that
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Go.
All right, so the One Shore Road, right?
Yes.
So this one, we received the request from DOS on January 22nd.
That's not-
So the month is going to be up February 22nd, which is
Right.
before our next meeting.
And there's seawalls in there, which they can't do, right? They can't add seawalls, and you say that?
It looks like it's just
No, they-
maintenance.
They are, well, they're not,
No.
no. They
Oh.
are
Reconstruct
replacing
damage.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
reconstruct.
damaged. They're repairing them with an in-kind, in-place replacement,
Right.
repair.
Oh, right, because
Repair.
you've read through
Right.
the,
I went over the whole thing.
So, before we
yes.
even start talking about it, because we just received it today.
Yeah.
Did the referral come from DOS, and how did we get? the
Only
letter?
from DOS. We just got this
Right, we don't have an
memo.
application.
There is no
We have
application.
an email from DOS to Greg saying, request for comments.
Yeah,
Right.
and I did call the consultants that prepared, because they've done other projects.
It's
here,
Race.
Race.
It's Race who did it.
And they're preparing an application for your board. I think they decided to pursue the state approvals first because of, the recent other applications that they've been involved in that have been kind of slowed down as you wait for more information from the state.
Right.
That's the way it needs to be done. This way we're all on the same page.
Right, but.
Right,
but
but this
in-
is-
but in
They
it-
could send
but
it to us at
hang
the
on, but
same
in their
time.
defense, and in, I think, DOS's defense, we can't control what the applicants do, right?
Right.
So, and this whole consistency process is supposed to be this informing of all of the agencies. So in this case, we are one of the agencies. So in some ways, I think they're doing the right thing. It's kind of a shock to us, but
Right, but my question is did we get the information from the applicant or DOS?
No,
DOS.
DOS.
Okay.
right. So I think, again, on this one, the first thing we're going to say is that,
Wait.
go ahead.
However, DOS provided us with the entire application.
Right.
The entire race application.
yeah.
Which is what they're supposed to do.
So it's not like DOS, cherry picked what they wanted to
Right,
send
but we
us.
Or just send us a letter or
We
whatever.
just received it today.
That's not true. 22nd.
Well, the
Yeah,
22nd,
the
we
22nd.
received
No, I'm
it
talking
today.
about we received the information
Yeah.
today.
Today, yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was going to be on this agenda or not. So
I'm just waiting.
Well, I went through it. I have a list of all of the policy
All right,
considerations. that we
so
have.
let's just, so basically, let me just read the DOS's statement, okay?
Right.
Reconstruct the south seawall, 170 and 270 feet of the west seawall with minor maintenance, chinking and repointing to the remainder of the wall. Build a 4-foot by 61-foot steel fixed pier with a 3-foot by 36-foot aluminum gangway with leading to a 12 by 16 timber float secured with 4 anchor piles and a boat lift. So
Wow.
the steel the steel pier will be supported by 8 12.75-inch, that's like that, diameter piles filled with concrete spaced on 15 foot on center. The
Right.
boat lift will be on 4 piles. Reconstruct the historic gable,
Gazebo.
incorporating a seasonal kayak dock to the gazebo for the Van Armoridge Mill Pond.
A
I thought that
public
when you buy a
dock?
house on the water
No,
now, you're
private.
supposed to assume you're not getting any dock if you don't have one. Like, isn't that kind of a rule that you don't?
Yes, it would be nice.
This
Yes.
is,
We have to look at our.
Bananas.
harbor management plan, but we don't have all the information.
yeah.
Right. Well,
Well, right, but we have to, Greg and Glenn and I spoke to DOS on this briefly, and basically what they said, kind of what Steve said, give them any concerns with a policy that we feel may be not consistent, right? Or that we feel definitely is not consistent, right?
right.
So again, let's just go through. So
Let's go through
application,
all the policies.
right, and
Okay, so let's start
go
with,
ahead, Jen.
well, we could start, I narrowed it down to 7A, of course. There's no explanation.
Right.
And we need to see a proposed gazebo.
Yeah.
But I think that, because there were no pictures of anything in the race application, nothing. There are a couple of maps and a couple of topos, but there's no.
Well, and also, what about what that does to their neighbors' views?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they're-
But not only what it does to the neighbors'
Wow.
views, but how it impacts the ground underneath, the water underneath that gazebo, and how it's going to, because clearly no one's using the dilapidated gazebo that's currently there, right?
I was thinking, is that gazebo eligible for the historic register?
They say
I
it's
don't know.
historic.
Right,
Yeah, could be.
I don't
So
know.
that's a
I would
concern,
say
right?
7A,
Yeah, so 7A. 11,
11.
I want to know exactly where the wall is going to be, because there really is no indication. It seems to me that they might be trying to push this wall out just a little bit on both the pond side and the other side. Did you see that?
I did not.
So,
In the pictures, it looked
Oh.
like they extended concrete
Yeah.
above the seawall.
well, they did. They are
Exactly.
making it
18
18
inches
inches
Yeah.
higher.
Right.
Yeah,
Wow.
right.
So
So
you're
11.
talking left to right.
12, same issues. 17, again, back to the gazebo and the kayak dock. I don't think there's
Back
a
to the
kayak,
house, too.
and back to the house. And I don't think there's a kayak dock there currently. So adding a
can't really
kayak
tell.
dock is
Yeah.
not,
Well,
yeah.
that also,
Yeah,
you're
on
gonna
the
have to
property
move
and
a lot of natural
incorporating.
stuff to add a slope down.
How,
Right.
well,
And 44, it's just plain
Wait, don't
ass.
go that far.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat 17? I'm just trying to keep track.
17, back to the gazebo, the kayak dock,
Also the house.
and the house.
Because the house, I would guess the seawalls is what you're trying to protect is the house. What you're
Right.
supposed to do is move the house back. I don't know if they have the property to do that.
right, but I
They
don't
don't.
think
I don't
that,
know.
they don't say they're doing anything to the house.
Doesn't make a difference.
no, they're just reconstructing the seawall.
Which,
The south
which,
and the
yeah, but I
west
think if
walls.
If they're
it's,
not doing anything to the house, they might be doing the seawall to protect the house, so they
That's
don't
what I'm
have to.
saying.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I
right,
said.
right, so I think that's the least of our problems on this one.
Policy 19.
19, they don't even do.
What's
They
nice,
skip
don't do.
over 19 and go right to 21.
the
That was 19 and an A.
Or policy 20, but policy 20 is more applicable because when seawalls were built in the village of Mamaroneck, prior to our 1989 Lands of the Water study, it was found that some people's property encroached on the public trust lands.
Right.
Well,
So-
is there public trust land there? did not think that that's
Only
all
people
within.
that could tell us is OGS. It's not in our maps.
So we need that information.
Well, their claim is that it is all private property. There's no public access. There's no public
Fine, but-
transportation.
Provide documentation to support that.
Okay,
Fine.
so let's add 19,
20, actually.
20.
Boy, there's a lot of stuff
Actually,
happening around
20.
this pond here.
So you want to
I
skip
would
over?
say 20 is more applicable.
Do you want to skip over 19?
The publicly on portion, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
Unless
It's not a
they're
public
giving,
beach.
It's not a public.
It's not a public beach.
Well, every
20
beach
is
is
more.
public, right, to get access, well, there's no
Right.
access to
No.
it.
there's no access.
Lands immediately
it's
adjacent
on-
to
I'd
the
say 20 is more
foreshore or the water's edge.
You'd have to go through private property to get.
Actually, you
Correct.
might not, because there's a private beach there, well, it's a private beach, but for the neighborhood, isn't there somewhere around there? I'm
On
not
Van
sure.
Amherst?
But
Depends on who owns.
It's
the
on
underwater land.
at Greenhaven, but not at Van Amherst.
It depends on who's the owner of the underwater lands.
Yeah,
It
okay.
depends. Depends. We don't know. No.
So they skipped until 21, recreational policies.
Yeah,
And in that statement, they said the site as well as surrounding sites are residential. Public water-dependent uses are not anticipated. Right. So I think that they are saying none of it is public. Right. So that falls under the same,
That's fine. but
20.
They've got to provide us with the record that shows that
that's fine.
they own the land
I can't,
and underwater lands.
not.
It's not in our underwater land study.
Because where do they want to put this pier? They don't really say, or do they say in there? Is it out
do.
into, not into the pond, it's into the harbor,
Well,
right?
there's two. There's a gazebo in the pond.
That's which is going to be, which is going to be over here
It's going
somewhere.
to be right. No, go back, go back. Right
There,
Yeah, that's
okay.
it. That's it.
And then the dock is going to come out
Right.
this way?
It's going to come out
Guys, can we,
right here, next to.
Next to theirs.
Jen and
Would have been helpful to have.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I
You
just
know,
wanted to,
hands.
Did the application itself say that the gazebo is historic?
Yes,
Oh, it did?
Okay, well, that implicates
it
23.
says that it's 70 years old. The application
Okay.
itself says that the,
23. We need
yep, 23.
state historic preservation on that.
says the existing, it says the existing seawall's been in place for over 70 years.
That's-
But the memo from DOS says that the gazebo is historic.
Right.
Reconstruct historic gazebo on the property.
Mhm.
And so
23.
so the DOS would not have gotten that language by themselves.
23.
What about the one on rebuilding with the reconstruction of
Erosion protection.
erosion protection, it has to be done
for
so that it-
30 years.
30
right?
years.
Policy 13 definitely. applies.
Well,
You're right, Tony.
The race documents specifically say good for 30 years.
Yeah, what else
Yeah.
would they say?
That's fine.
yeah.
That's fine, but they're gonna have to show how.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm just saying that they already, we can't throw back at them, well, is it good for 30 years? Because it says in there, it's good for 30 years. But a lot of their statements I found to be sort of blanket boilerplate language.
Of course. That's
All
what
right.
we usually get.
So let's do this. Just, Greg, let's go through the list of policies that we have concerns with. 7A, 44, 11, 12, 17, we said 19, 20, right?
Not 19.
Not 19.
Not
21?
23.
23.
What is 21 in or out?
Well, that's public.
Public access. So, well, we
No,
don't really
Because
know.
Public water dependent and water enhanced recreation. It's
All right.
private, this is a private property.
Right.
Right.
20, so that's probably out. 23, the historic gable.
Yep.
And 13, maybe the flood protection. All right, I think we have enough.
And
to-
44, you put.
44
Yeah,
we said
44 he
that.
said.
Yeah, we got-
That's certainly enough
We got
to get us
33 and
started.
37.
What are
Best
those two?
management practices.
Well, we could probably put that in on everyone, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay, so we can add that.
And there's one policy that deals with water quality. I forgot which one it was, and it would particularly apply to this.
Is Van Armitage Pond one of our,
38 is water quality.
Is that the one?
is the Van Armitage Pond one of our special
Yes,
resources?
yes.
So how can they,
Absolutely is.
Right,
so Doreen, Van Armitage is one of our special resources, right?
yes,
7A.
Yeah,
So that's 7A?
it's,
yes.
Okay,
you look at the natural resources map.
all right. I got enough. Okay, let's move on here. That was One Shore Road.
Nice. One
Well,
shot.
also, can I
Yes.
just point out specifically in the race application for policy 44, they say, in their explanation, they say, any impact to the tidal wetlands will be minor in nature and limited to the duration of the construction. And then in the next sentence, they say, the proposed pier has been designed by DEC guidelines and industry standards to minimize adverse impacts to the environment. But that's not what we're going for. We're not
Yeah.
going for minimized
No.
adverse
No.
impacts.
Yeah.
We're going for
Yeah.
no
Avoid.
adverse.
And I know if you talk to the harbor master, I mean, there's always that discussion about pilings versus anchors and all that. I mean, we're certainly gonna have to get a view from him.
But we also should
Yeah.
make
Pilings
it
are
clear
better
that we
than
do not have an application from this applicant
Yeah.
in
so that's
front of
right.
us.
Right,
However, we've identified these policies
Multiple.
based on your
Right.
information apply.
Okay,
okay,
And we haven't reviewed it.
okay,
very good.
all
Are
right.
Next.
significant.
Now, all right, so then the next one,
We do much better with no one here.
Foreshore Road, we got the 29th. So this one will be due the day after our next meeting. So this one seems much more minor. Let me just read it.
That's-
Maintain and repair the existing seawall and install an outfall to manage stormwater. Proposed maintenance will take place in the footprint of the existing structure, will reduce sediment from seeping out from behind the wall. The outfall will manage stormwater, help prevent sediment into the sound. The outfall will be 12 inches.
That house is so high, I don't see how there's an issue with. And there's already seawall back there. It
Aren't
doesn't
they
look like
demolishing the house?
They are.
But
So
this,
isn't that the whole project, not just the seawall?
There,
we don't have an application.
for foreshore, yeah, sure we do. I just didn't bring all my stuff.
We-
Wasn't
we
this the
have
one
an
that they said
application
that the,
Sorry, just to be clear, this wasn't posted on an agenda.
no.
All right.
Right.
No,
So-
foreshore wasn't on, that's why I don't have any of my stuff.
All right, so should we not discuss Foreshore Road? We should not?
We're gonna have to respond to the DOS. Is that
Well,
what you're talking about?
so
Tom?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm,
We should do that at our next meeting and then send them.
yeah, and if I'm misremembering, I
Be ready.
thought that Foreshore Road said that the only thing that they're here is because they want to put up a deck, and if we decide that
No,
that's something else.
That's Capel, I think.
Cove
Cove
Road.
Road.
Too many projects.
All right, so Foreshore Road, we'll discuss at the next meeting.
Okay.
Yes,
Our next meeting is the 28th?
of February?
Yeah, February 20th.
February 28th.
Wow, really?
I don't know why, but it is.
So do we
I
need
have
another special meeting? I'll kill you, everybody. No more special meetings. All right, listen, everybody, I moved to close the meeting. I don't know, do we have to make seconds or
We
anything?
never moved to open it, did we?
No,
Yeah, I have it on the 28th too.
it's not a meet, is this a meet? All right, so,
Move to open.
so
Move to open.
Oh my
a move to open and close the special meeting.
That's called an open
I
and
so
shut
So
case.
moved.
So moved,
Second?
bitch.
Second.
All in favor?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, any nays? All right, thank you, everybody, for coming out. I know
Thank you for
We
doing
can't
that.
have-
I'm
we
killing
can't
you.
have meetings